Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Martin Lukacs. Today, we're airing a panel discussion with frontline organizers on fighting the Carney liberal agenda. The panel was recorded last week in Ottawa at the Broadbent Institute's yearly summit. Back in October, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, made an interesting admission to a U.S. media outlet. He was asked what he has learned from Donald Trump. And this is what he said. "I don't fully subscribe to this, but I see the effectiveness, the value of flooding the zone, of doing multiple things at the same time." Flooding the zone, of course, is a term of Stephen Bannon's, Donald Trump's MAGA strategist, and refers to the torrent of policy and legislation intended to disorient and overwhelm any opposition, and is what has been unleashed by Donald Trump, both in his first term in office and this time around as well. And that is precisely what Mark Carney has overseen in his own first year, a veritable tsunami of pro-corporate policies and legislation under the cover of the disorientation and shock of the Trump attacks against Canada. The brilliant organizers and leaders you're going to hear from today are on the front lines of that flood, trying to reckon with the massive changes that Carney has unleashed in this country and figuring out how to fight back against them. So let me introduce the speakers today. Janelle Lapointe is a climate justice and Indigenous rights organizer from the Staladen First Nation and senior advisor at the David Suzuki Foundation. Syed Hussan is the executive director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and on the secretariat of the Migrant Rights Network. Rachel Small is the Canada lead for World Beyond War and a founding member of Jews Say No to Genocide. Atiya Jaffar is the team lead for the climate justice organization 350 Canada team. And Nathan Prier is the president of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, or CAPE, which represents 28,000 federal sector workers. So in no particular order, Janelle, I thought we could start with you.
I'm from a small village called Stella, which is located in the north central part of so-called BC. It's my matrilineal homelands, the place where my grandmother was born, and a place that is so beautiful to me, abundant. Early settlers write about just how abundant the land was and how well we took care of the land. But it's also a place that I think tells a story about what has happened here in Canada. Massive extraction from the fur trade, forestry, mining, and now oil and gas. We struggle with soaring costs of groceries, a crumbling healthcare system, and now a fast-tracked agenda to continued extraction without Indigenous consent. What we know is that Indigenous people have been systematically excluded from the economy since contact. I think people don't realize the recent implications of that. And in the area where I grew up, that meant that 2 generations before me, people who are still alive, my grandmother's age, were not allowed to seek employment off the reserve without permission from an Indian agent. And people were not going out of their way to create jobs on the reserve. So when we hear promises of jobs and you're wondering why this tactic is working so well in Indigenous communities, it's because jobs and employment has been very recently weaponized against us, and Indigenous people are facing the systemic impoverization while corporation after corporation, while the colonial governments have gotten rich at our expense. And in fact, a new tactic had emerged where corporations were spending more time in my community. They now have Indigenous engagement employees who are paid massive salaries to just come and talk and build relationships with my people. They're sponsoring community barbecues. They're showing up and chatting with our elders. And more cynical than that, they're also filling the gap that the government had failed to for decades. This was in an era, of course, of a Justin Trudeau liberal agenda where he ran on a reconciliation platform, overpromised and severely underdelivered. We had arsenic poisoned water for several decades in my community. Arsenic cannot be boiled out. Poisoned water from the molybdenum mine runoff near my community. And the only way we were able to afford a water treatment center was not from government support, but from saying yes to an oil and gas pipeline that we did not want. We are in a circumstance where our fluent speakers are rapidly passing on, and we were able to build a language center from money from a pipeline that we did not want. And this has become a tactic that all forms of governments are taking, and they're using this really pretty term, you may have heard it, called economic reconciliation, which means that how we do reconciliation is to allow corporations to give the wealth that Ottawa has stolen from people back to community. And when I first heard this term, I thought, oh man, are they gonna give cash back? Are we getting reparations? Like the term economic reconciliation, I thought we were talking about, repairing our traditional economy, allowing us to lead a new economy. But what it really has come to mean is that we have to assimilate in this capitalist colonial framework, the same framework that has put us in the position that we're in. In this new circumstance where we have a Carney as leader, he's really weaponizing the threat of Donald Trump and saying that we need these major projects and we need them now. He quickly adopted this framework. And so what that means is we now have fast-tracking legislation, Bill C5, as well as provincial counterparts in BC and Ontario, that put these major resource projects forward and remove some of the safeguards that we had, like environmental assessments and consultation processes that were already severely flawed. So what we're up against now is, when Martin, you say flooded the zone, I came to my mind that, Indigenous communities have been dealing with a flooded zone for a long time. We are severely stretched, under capacity, and already struggling to keep up with the amount of claims that come across the desk to our land. And so now we have these major projects that have extreme risks to our lands, our waters, our culture, our safety of our women and girls, that bring in man camps, strange men from across the country to our vulnerable communities, that have to use our crumbling health services and often get priority to some of the spaces that we've been excluded from. And we are told that is a gift to us. I think the most sinister part of it is how the Carney government has repackaged this as generosity and as reconciliation. And now we're in a situation where Indigenous governments are likely going to be taking out massive loans to build some of these projects. In my community, the biggest threats are LNG and the electrification projects that are going to power LNG and data centers over homes. We are being told that these projects are financially prosperous, and frankly, that they're going to happen without us, that we will consult, but ultimately the decision comes down to the Major Projects Office and the hand-selected Indigenous people that already have vested interests in these extractive projects to make the decision for us. And my worry about where the movement is at is I think we've adopted a tactic post-Idle No More of waiting for Indigenous people to lead. I think the movement is waiting for another Wet'suwet'en to happen, waiting for militarized police to be on the front lines, and then maybe we'll pay attention. But the government is playing chess. They are seeing that the rights and title of Indigenous people, the story of this country is becoming more mainstream, and that the support for Indigenous governance is growing, and they're weaponizing that. They are saying, if you support Indigenous rights and title, well, what do you think about this Indigenous-owned pipeline? And it's working. It's working. That is a chess move that I wish we had been more prepared for. And we have a word for that, when we get impoverished people to take out massive loans that will have no return on investment. We call that predatory lending. We do not call that economic reconciliation. And when I put it that way, it makes sense why our banker prime minister has been so goddamn good at using this tactic. So it's really important that we build those strong relationships, that we call out that narrative, and that we engage with communities to address this crisis of economic imagination that's not only plaguing Indigenous communities, but is plaguing us across Canada. I mean, the fact that we can't come up with another project to provide 200 temporary jobs in an LNG region is pretty pathetic. But that, to me, is a really exciting piece of the work that to defeat the Carney agenda, we get to work more closely together, and that we get to get into a dream space and start thinking about economic solutions that work for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities across the country.
The abundance of choices here. How about you, Hussan?
Maybe what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk about like what is immigration policy? What is immigration justice? What is Carney doing about it? Right now, every year, 4 times more people come into the country on temporary permits, on study permits, on work permits, as refugee claimants. Most of these people pay most of the taxes, but don't get most of the services. Are people who are in farms and fishery plants and healthcare and on logistics and in packing, are coming here effectively in a revolving door immigration system. We come here for a few years, and as our members say to us, you people treat us like chewing gum. Come, chew us, then when you're done with us, you spit us out. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people are coming into this country, denied basic rights and freedoms, and then eventually becoming undocumented. That has been the system for a very long time. What has really shifted in the last couple of years is the shift towards a particular form of scapegoating that is emerging as we are entering into a global recession, right? We have to name what that is. Right now, if you ask an average person in this country, and I'm sure you've all heard it, our housing prices are directly connected to immigration. Jobs, immigration. Affordability, immigration. Pierre Poilievre just did a whole campaign last week, which Breach made a video about, thank you, about how, in fact, our healthcare lines are due to immigration. You can blame migrants for everything. Now, we know that racism is a strategy to divide the working class, that it is a way through which people are being pitted against each other to distract from holding those at the top responsible, right? We know that. But what we're facing as a result of that is a very specific kind of mass exclusion. We have seen, depending on how you count the numbers, between 1.2 and 1.8 million people whose study and work permits were not being able to renew last year. That's between 3,000 and 3,500 people daily left the country. As a result of that, we are seeing this massive cuts to our tax system, right? So it's a $50 billion reduction to the tax revenue. The GDP growth is down 3 points just in the last few years. Some of it has to do with tariffs. Some of it has to do with the fact that Canada has actually been using, not just Canada, all these countries have been using immigration since at least the 90s as a bit of a substitute to economic growth. Because if you bring in millions of people and they work and they spend money here, then you can actually get over the fact that what has happened here in the post sort of NAFTA free trade moment and the way in which our society has largely been deindustrialized, particularly in rural centers, particularly because we know what it's like to be in rural communities because we organize farm workers. And what's happened is immigration has kind of somehow managed to hold up the economy. When you've got millions of people paying into your welfare system but not being able to access it, that allows for your schools to be funded, for your healthcare to be functional, right? So for the last 30 years, migrants have been propping up this country. They've been propping up this country while being excluded, while being exploited. And now we're being scapegoated. And as we're being pushed out, you've entered a kind of this like doom circle, basically, because people are struggling to pay rent. They're struggling to afford their homes. They're struggling to afford groceries. They're struggling to get good jobs. And they're being told that the problem is migrants. And then migrants are being pushed out, but the economy will worsen. And those same people are going to be told, okay, the problem is still migrants. And so they're going to call for more migrants to be pushed out. And the circle continues. Unless we break this cycle, there is really no other way through. Permanent resident status is dropping. And as permanent resident status is dropping, so is funding for settlement agencies in a huge way, right? So is cuts to the federal public sector, right? And what is that doing? That means that there are fewer people out there defending migrants in the communities, putting out talking points against anti-immigrant rhetoric. The overall space is shrinking. And so when us in the migrant justice movement are speaking up, our voices are frankly not being heard. We are organizing migrants in our communities every day. Last year, for example, we were able to win hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen wages back from employers. During a massive heat wave, we were able to get ACs into homes where homes are 40 degrees Celsius inside, right? So we can win those kinds of changes. But what we can't do is deal with this overwhelming economic crisis that migrants are both being blamed for and their exclusion is worsening, right? This is what we were at before Carney's election, okay? This isn't, and then Carney comes in, and what does he do? One of his first major bills, Bill C-12, right? Currently Bill C-12, then Bill C-2, is effectively, does two main things. One is that, and it will pass next week. It'll pass next week. We're trying our hardest to stop it, but there's no way. It's in Senate. What it does is it says that any person who's a refugee claimant who's been here for longer than 1 year will not be able to seek asylum or protection. Letters are going to go out, and people are going to suddenly find that their refugee application, even if they've made it, suddenly is going to be put into another system called the PRA application process. The other thing that they're doing is they've given themselves the power to cancel any groups of immigration permit whenever they want. What is a group? Gender is a group, race is a group, ethnicity is a group, nationality is a group, age is a group, region is a group. Being able to cancel groups of permits like that is now going to be enshrined in law for this and all future governments. All future governments will have this power. And that's just the first major bill he's brought on immigration. 1,000 new CBSA officers are going to be hired. That's our version of ICE. Right now, deportations have almost doubled. They've gone up to about 22,000 last year. That number was closer to 7,000 during COVID. And the surveillance and the technology that is being brought in Canada is at a much higher pace. AI is now going to be used to make a lot of these decisions. It's already being used to make these decisions. So as we are seeing the economic system completely be forced to be restructured and people are being excluded, there's a huge increase in undocumentedness. It has to be. So we are in a very particular calamitous cycle here. And if folks don't understand it, don't really understand it, because what's happening in part because of the economic contraction is it is justifying budget cuts to every sector. The racism and xenophobia that is being embedded into people's minds makes it so that climate has actually dropped as a top issue of concern for the first time in so many years. Immigration is higher, right? Which means that you can't actually make moves on any of our other social justice issues, because people are convinced that if you get rid of immigrants, everything else will get better. So fighting against xenophobia and racism is a strategic necessity. It is essential to your own work.
How about you, Atiya?
I do believe that the Carney agenda is possible because of the groundwork that was laid by Trudeau. And I think that's really, really important to recognize. It's certainly really important to recognize for climate, because Trudeau left behind a legacy of mediocrity. He looked at the climate emergency, looked it right in the eye, one of the most defining struggles of our lifetime, and he said, okay, yeah, baby steps that don't really make a meaningful improvement in people's lives. He didn't leave a strong legacy to build on, and what we're seeing with Carney is that he is fully regressing us back, tearing apart every climate policy that we've won over the last decade. But the thing is, these were all mediocre policies. They were not policies that brought along the public or won public support to begin with. So what I would say in the climate movement, how we're viewing the Carney agenda is it's an agenda of rampant deregulation and rampant deregulation to expand extractivism. And we know that he's borrowing from Trump's playbook, but he's also saying that he's fighting back. And that's why he won the election as well. He was seen as the best chance to fight back against Trump, to challenge Donald Trump. And the way that he proposed to do this was to bring forward nation-building projects. But what he's calling nation-building projects are essentially just projects that are tearing apart our communities and worsening the climate emergency. So to go through some of the decisions, one of his first agenda items as Prime Minister was to build the Major Projects Office, which seeks to fast-track so-called nation-building projects. What does that mean? That means cutting policies and creating free passes for industry to not have to follow environmental protections. So the Major Project Office can allow industry to bypass over a dozen federal laws to protect the environment and climate and Indigenous rights and our communities. And it's not really a hidden agenda because you can see that he's assigned the former CEO of the Trans Mountain Pipeline to be the CEO of this Major Projects Office. So it's very clear what the agenda here is, and you can see it in the projects that were shortlisted by the Major Projects Office as well. It's largely mining projects, fossil fuel projects, like the Sea Lissom's fracked gas facility, which is backed by actually no fewer than 3 Epstein-linked Wall Street billionaires. So we're building resilience against Trump in America, but we're also supporting American fossil fuel projects. The logic just doesn't stand. And then after this, of course, we had the Alberta-Canada MOU with Danielle Smith. Carney deepened his commitment to deregulation through this in alignment with the demands of the fossil fuel industry. So this MOU led to the scrapping of the pollution cap on the fossil fuel industry, scrapping the clean electricity regulations. And perhaps most alarming is the Alberta-Canada MOU just put a new West Coast pipeline on the table. This mystery project is intended to bring Canadian tar sands oil to Asian markets through the Pacific coast. So all this is happening, but I think one of the biggest struggles that we're facing in the climate movement is knowing that public opinion seems to be on Carney's side. Carney's agenda seems to be resonant amongst many mainstream and even progressive-leaning Canadians, or people who self-identify as progressive-leaning. People are grasping for some economic stability, and the logic seems to be making sense to people. He's maybe even promising pipelines that he doesn't intend to build because he's just winning good faith with the conservative politicians. And the fact remains that even if some of these projects fail to materialize, the damage is done. Whether or not these pipelines are built, the Overton window has been moved. These projects like a Northern Gateway Pipeline 2.0, the first one was defeated by coastal First Nations, a potential Trans Mountain 3.0 that would potentially run through my neighborhood. These projects were previously considered unconceivable, and now they're fully back on the table. The climate regulations that we fought for, yes, they were mediocre, but they have been rolled back, and public consent has been manufactured for these reversals. So winning even these mediocre policies back will be a steep and uphill battle. And the fossil fuel industry, I find this to be one of the most alarming things. The fossil fuel industry isn't hiding. They don't feel like they need to wear a mask anymore. They don't need to retreat to the shadows anymore. And this is best evidenced by the fact that Pathways Alliance, which is an industry front group, they just rebranded themselves to call themselves the Oil Sands Alliance, because they were like, this will better reflect our actual work, which is to promote and expand the oil sands industry. So we don't need to pretend that we're the Pathways Alliance. We're the Oil Sands Alliance. So we're in a new era. And fossil fuel expansion has been successfully sold to the public as a means of nation building and economic protection. But we know that's not what it is. And what this essentially is a gross exploitation of widespread economic anxiety. We know that expanding the fossil fuel industry only enriches billionaires. We know that only oil companies will benefit from this, and largely many American-owned oil companies. This will entrench our dependence on the US, which is the largest market for Canadian oil and gas. And it'll tie us into a boom and bust economy and rob us of public funds that could go towards projects that we actually need, that actually protect us from the climate emergency and build resilience in a time of national and global crisis. And of course, worst of all, this is expanding climate chaos. And the stakes are high. We are accelerating away from our global commitment to hit zero emissions by 2050. That means surpassing the maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that was established in the Paris Climate Agreement. And I was there when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. The words that were being used by Global South country was, it's 1.5 to survive. This is a matter of life and death. If we surpass this threshold, we are going to see entire island nations go underwater. We are going to see catastrophic climate disasters, like in my homelands in Pakistan, where in 2022, 33 million people were displaced and irreversibly impacted by catastrophic climate-driven flooding. These kinds of disasters will only increase, and that's 33 million people just from one climate disaster in Pakistan that is 80% of Canada's population. If we fail to act on the climate emergency, we're also seeing impacts close to us where we're already getting used to breathing smoke every summer. We're getting used to losing our neighbors to extreme heat. We're getting used to seeing hectares upon hectares burned from wildfires. Like last year, an area the size of New Brunswick, and that was only the second worst wildfire season in Canada. So it continues to be one of the most defining crises of our lifetime, and we have to fight back. You know, we're talking about flooding the zone, but you know, we're seeing our homelands flooded, and it's critical to fight back. And Janelle, I'm so glad that you mentioned the dream space that we need, because it's really important for us to think through what is it that we actually need, because the projects that we actually need, the action that we actually need is something that would address the climate crisis, but it would just make life better for everyday people as well. Projects that expand access to affordable renewable energy, projects that meet the climate crisis but also meet the other overlapping crises that we face. Like we need homes, we need climate safe homes that also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need free public transit. We need electrified transportation systems. We need all of this and so much more. It would make life more affordable, it would make life better, and it would act on the climate emergency instead of making fossil fuel billionaires richer.
Thanks, Atiya. Rachel.
Throughout the election, in the lead up, watching this issue, this area very, very, very closely, I did not think that Carney's agenda was going to be primarily about building an economic prosperity, domestic policy, foreign policy based on war and militarism. That has been shocking to me. That has been a radical departure for this country, and it's been just like the linchpin of Carney's agenda in the, I guess, almost a year this week that he's been in power. And overwhelmingly, if I had to sum that up in a word, it's been about moving Canada closer and closer and closer to the US militarily, to a US-style way of moving in the world as a country, but also literally to deeper and deeper and deeper embedment, involvement in the US war industry, in the US military-industrial complex. So yes, despite talking on his election campaign, all the talk about elbows, in the Davis speech, all the talk about separating from the US, resisting big bullies, etc. You've all heard it, I don't need to repeat it. What Carney has actually done over the past year is just move Canada horrifyingly at breakneck speed down a path based on ever-increasing militarization and warmongering in lockstep with the US. This is the opposite of what he is saying he is doing, but if you look at what he's doing, this is what it is. And I mean, if this wasn't clear enough before, I think this horrific last week has really laid it bare. We've seen the Canadian government, I mean, speaking of oil industry and basically speaking of kind of not hiding the agenda anymore, the Canadian government's full-throated support for Israel and the US's, I mean, there's no words, just horrific, wildly illegal, blatantly imperialist bombings of Iran. I just don't know actually what could make it more clear, despite Carney's speeches, what the government of Canada is actually going to do, where they are or aren't going to actually draw any lines and are in closer alignment. Of course, we've seen this in starving of Cuba. I think that we read the speeches and then we look at what Canada's actual foreign policy looks like now, and it looks like unabashed support for the US's new and also not at all new campaign of imperialist warfare around the world. But in terms of his actual policy, never mind for the moment responding to the US's bombings, just a couple weeks ago, the Canadian government released a new defense industrial strategy, literally throwing around about $500 billion, in Carney's words, to ramp up military production, to ramp up arms exports, to weaken our already completely dysfunctional arms exports permitting process, and basically saying what we're going to do is we're going to bank Canada's future, our economic prosperity, on militarism and war profiteering. Not in some minor way, not as a minor industry, like this is going to be the way that Canada is going to be wealthy. This is a radical departure for Canada. To be doing this, to be saying this, to not be hiding behind a front of, oh, we're a peacekeeper in the world, to just be saying, no, actually, we're going to build our wealth on war and investing in the production of weapons of genocide. That's not a direct quote from him, but that is what it is. And specifically in that saying, we're going to ramp up military exports, arms exports, by 50%. We saw Canadian weapons being used in Trump's attacks on Venezuela. Notably, sensors made in Hamilton, Ontario, were key to the targeting of the strikes on Venezuelan boats. And of course, I think we've all seen over the past 2 years just how critical a part of arming Israel's genocide the Canadian war machine has been. I won't go through this in extensive detail. The Arms Embargo Now campaign has put out very extensive reports tracing the pipeline of weapons. So all that to say that Canada is already deeply implicated in just like literally arming some of the worst violence on the planet. That's where Canadian arms are intentionally flowing, not to mention the ones that sometimes get diverted, that end up literally in the hands of Russian troops, as has been exposed recently, that end up being used in Sudan, that end up being used in all kinds of other places. So when Carney is promising to cut out red tape, to increase by 50%, it's a future that he's seeing. He's trying to put this on steroids, essentially. Canada's current budget was a war budget, and it was like the type of military spending that we haven't seen since at least World War II. And this was in a context where Canadian military spending had already doubled in the past decade, when in June, Carney had already committed $9 billion overnight, and then now is committing to doubling our spending again and again over the next decade. We're talking about $150 billion per year in current dollars, sort of within the next 10 years. That's nearly 10 times Toronto's entire city budget. It's vastly more than the federal government spends on all health and social transfers to all the provinces and territories combined. And I think the implication, and sometimes this is said overtly, sometimes it's just implied, is, oh, this is what is needed to protect us from the US. And unfortunately, it's just couldn't be less true. It's truly the opposite. What this is an enormous gift to Trump. I mean, it's literally exactly what Trump demanded Canada do, first of all. But also, I mean, the reason this is giving Trump what he wants is this also the same reason that it's preposterous from a defense from the US perspective, which is that the Canadian and US militaries are already deeply intertwined. Carney's historic investment in militarism is perfectly aligned with further deepening that. That's why it's what Trump's wants, and that's why this investment could never actually be used to defend ourselves from the US. You could look at Canada's purchase of F-35s, these really dystopian fighter jets, enormously expensive, costing many millions of dollars. Plus, it's a US weapons system that Canada literally cannot use except in collaboration with the US. They control the part supplies, they control the upgrades. We rely on US air traffic towers to be able to run them. Like, literally, there's no way to use these jets in defense of the US, but it is an enormous gift to Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons company on the planet. Not to mention, as I said, that we have seen exactly what these jets are designed to do, to kill civilians by turning schools, hospitals, refugee camps, entire cities into ruins. These jets, there's over 900 pounds of rare earth elements in every single F-35 on the planet. And I mean, Carney's critical minerals agenda, as has been talked about today, they're not even pretending that these critical minerals are for batteries for electric vehicles, which they were doing for a long time. Now they're just being really clear that we're ramming through these projects, we're stealing Indigenous land, we're contaminating waterways to ram through these critical projects because they're necessary for war machines. That's what the critical mineral agenda is about. And in case anyone is worried that Canadian companies and families are not also getting super rich from this plan, Canada recently handed $8 billion to one of Canada's very wealthiest families, the Irvings, so that they could build new warships for Canada, not defensive weapons. They're built for offensive military operations, and literally their command and combat management systems are controlled by the US. Like, you can only use these warships in joint missions with the US. The decisions Canada is making now to ramp up its military budget, to escalate a global arms race, to buy warships, fighter jets, space missiles, etc., that's us making a promise, a commitment to wage war with these weapon systems for decades to come. They're buying these machines in order to use them. That is what Canada's foreign policy is going to look like if these purchases, if these budgets, if these war plans can go through.
And Nate, bring it home. It's bleak enough, but now you can tell us about public austerity.
I'm Nate Prier. I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. We're the third biggest federal public sector union, mostly policy analysts and translators. Let's just talk about like kind of what's at stake, what Carney is saying, what he's doing. You know, Carney's platform during the election was presented as this antidote to a very explicit austerity agenda of Poilievre. And so he also promised to cap, not cut, the public sector during the campaign. Of course, that was just a brazen lie. But we didn't know what we were expecting walking in with the new Carney government. But When we heard about budget 2025, he's talking about it as an investment budget. Carney announced the budget buildup, that capping, not cutting, actually meant massive, historic cuts, only rivaled by Chrétien, to government operations, and framed that as right-sizing a supposedly bloated public sector without impacting any core programs. It was going to be program neutral. So there's new spending going into defense and business investment, while corporate and capital gains taxes are being reduced. So it's corporate welfare on a vast scale. And so to offset that spending, and here's the spending less part of the comms line that they went with on budget day, Carney just asked every single federal department, excepting law enforcement and military and defense kind of areas of the government, for 15% cuts. Find them. Not, we know what we want to do and here's the staff we need, just find 15%. And so those cuts, those total, as we know now, about $60 billion and about 40,000 jobs being cut over 3 years. And so Carney, I think, was very strategic, though, on budget day. He didn't really attach anything to a big program cut. No social infrastructure is being gutted. It's going to be program neutral. We're going to find the 40,000 jobs, and that's not going to impact programs. So they said find 15%, and now we're finding out where they found that 15%. Very important to note here, remote work was off the table. $40 billion of real estate costs were said, we're not even touching that. Find it elsewhere. But we're working with our union siblings and groups like the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to start nailing down the program cuts as best as we can read them in these different departments now that we're seeing the comprehensive expenditure reviews and the layoff notices. But we're seeing it a little bit more clearly now. They're gutting offices that are doing critical public health work. Reconciliation work is being hit in every single department. There's a very strong pattern that we're starting to see there. Food and drug inspection offices, environmental safety offices, and a lot more. But yeah, like I said, Carney didn't have to own those cuts on budget day. It gets kind of slowly trickled out. Everyone here has said Carney is smart and strategic. That was very smart and strategic. Federal workers know how ideological these cuts are. This isn't just an accounting operation of right-sizing the public sector. They're being scapegoated for a deficit that they absolutely did not cause. And so even before Carney became leader, the narrative of restraint focused on the size of the federal public service implied that we'd hired too many people. And it's this familiar narrative of bloated public service offering no-show jobs to fat cat bureaucrats, that got invoked, and intentionally so. The Conservatives were hammering on that for a long time, and he leaned into it. But I want to get into the myths a bit more of the bloated public service. So yes, the public service did grow in absolute numbers over the past decade, but that was with major program expansions, right? Enhancements to benefits like the Canada Child Benefit, substantial increases in Indigenous services and infrastructure, and the creation of national dental care, pharmacare, childcare programs that largely tracked population growth too. But that's how the media likes to talk about it. I think the much more important stat in this conversation on whether or not the public service is bloated is this one. It's how much do we spend on public servants as a percentage of the operating budget. So how much do we spend on salaries, benefits, pensions as a percentage of the money we're spending on operations. And this is the inverse of what the media narrative is on the public sector and its bloat right now. But we're actually spending less proportionally at the end of the Trudeau years than we were in the Harper years. It was 10% under the Trudeau government, 14% under Harper. So the point is that programs expanded pretty significantly, and someone needed to do that work. Someone needs to do the work if you're promising these things to Canadians. And when it's all added up, we're actually more efficient now than we were before on the labor costs of delivering these programs. So just this austerity wave, the current one that we're in, actually started, though, under Trudeau. His brand was tanking, things were bad at the end. And so there was a lot of howling from the Conservatives on this myth of the bloated public service. He started just announcing job cuts without dialing back any program commitments. When the work still needs to be done, and public servants are burning out at a record rate on skeleton teams trying to just keep the wheels on, who do you think ends up picking up the slack? I'm asking you. Consultants, McKinsey, Deloitte. Consultants, baby. They cost $1.25 on the dollar for what it for what it costs just to keep a public servant at their desk, right? And we've shattered the record for the last 2 years on consultant spending. It was $20 billion in 2024 on consultants. And so lots of my members are now working beside the McKinsey or Deloitte consultant who just replaced their coworker and is costing more than it costs to keep the old guy at their desk. It's a quick little win. It's an optics thing to be we are cutting jobs. We're finally trimming the fat here. And then it just goes straight to the private sector to do the same work without building institutional memory, without building a career track, and going to usually pretty nepotistic friends of the current government. So, cuts on this scale, they don't streamline operations. They disrupt workflows, they cut your mentorship change, they break down institutional memory in a big way. And then they kind of start to ruin services over time. And so Carney presenting this as like a modernization, very tired kind of like trope, a neoliberal trick here, where public services get starved of the resources that they need to deliver well, and then it's a precursor to privatization. But he's also, and I think this is a very important part, he's taking an absolute moonshot that AI, none of which has been tested or trialed, is going to be able to replace a third of the public sector. And that's, of course, not unrelated to the fact that the tech lobby is the single biggest lobby in the lobbyist registry right now. It happened in a much more naked form in Elon Musk's like DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency operation in the US, but it's being managed now by like a less cringe technocrat. It's very Doge-like though. There's a very direct connection to the tech lobby's power and access right now, and this absolute moonshot that AI is going to be able to replace these vast parts of the public sector. So Canadians are being asked right now to accept worse public services, and public servants are being asked to accept big job losses. And there's all this corporate welfare flowing to the war industries, infrastructure tied to extraction, subsidies, tax relief for corporations. It's not a smaller government though. It's just a reoriented one. We're reorienting things directly into corporate welfare that used to go or could potentially go to a lot of things like shoring up the national childcare system, which is at very big risk if we don't sign deals with these big provinces, and provide the backstop and the funding and the workforce plan for that. And in the meantime, the private sector, very dubious kind of AI with very messy lobbyist influence behind it, is going to pick up the slack. But in practice, Carney is carrying out almost everything that the Canadian corporate class started lobbying for in the context of the tariff threat, tax reform, erosion of progressive taxation, growth over redistribution, harder line on labor and collective bargaining. And we saw what happened with Air Canada, right? They're willing to push the big red button to say we will override your collective bargaining rights right now. And if you don't have the numbers to throw down in a wildcat strike, that's just going to be the way it works. But, we've learned from those flight attendants, and huge applause to them as always. But I can tell you right now that this next bargaining round in the federal public sector is going to be pretty high drama. Carney can and he will stonewall bargaining on every possible front, and he's going to push the big red button every chance that he gets, and we're prepping for that, but it's daunting, right? These are attacks on working class life in this country. So in terms of what we can do together, we have to unlock worker power, of course, but just from the ground up, I think with a theory of change that meaningfully connects all the important work that everybody's doing here with the very specific kind of power that organized labor has, right? Our ability to shut it down in a very direct way to the employer, which is the government of Canada. And public sector labor, it's a house full of contradictions. We're well aware of that. But there's also just kind of real objective strategic leverage there. And there's a lot of challenges to building, a serious strike threat for unions who haven't even gone that route before. But I just think the overall numbers on their own terms are pretty decisive, and everybody should keep that in mind. But we're walking into a bargaining year at CAPE, and we're walking into a bargaining year with a bunch of other bargaining groups across the federal public sector who, all told, we're talking about 150,000 people who could be in a potential strike position in a pretty short amount of time, and who are absolutely done with being scapegoated and abused. And if these groups coordinated demands and had a public coalition backing them, we're talking about a massive group of workers with a potentially wild amount of leverage. But that said, historically, there haven't been Quebec-style common fronts. If you don't know the Front Commun, the common front in Quebec, there's basically a general strike in 2023. It's a tactic they use where disparate groups of provincial public sector workers, teachers, nurses, things like that, make common demands and say we're not going below a certain floor. They got 15% wage increases from the Legault government, which is not a friend of workers. In the federal public sector, that hasn't really happened, and there also haven't been very robust coalition efforts to connect with Canadians who are getting hammered by, Carney or Harper or Chrétien-style austerity. But I think it still kind of holds, at least in theory, that to be most impactful, a common front would have to come together, and we'd need to be connected to a big outside coalition backing up our demands and fighting the cuts. And that work, I think, is still largely ahead of us.
So you have heard a picture that is in stark contrast to Carney's carefully cultivated image. And that is probably the core competency of the Liberal Party and the Liberal government, their inexhaustible inability to reinvent themselves as progressive standard bearers and defenders of the nation. But this new course that Carney is charting, as you've heard, turns out, in fact, to really be about a doubling down on the agenda that we have been fighting for decades in this country. Colonial extraction and austerity, the gusher of corporate welfare that you described so well, the migrant scapegoating. And so, of course, the question is, what is to be done? And and the people on the stage, you have been building a fledgling coalition to fight Carney. It kind of had its coming out moment in the fall with the Draw the Line protest that happened across the country. It was a really impressive display of a coalition effort. We've heard a lot of unanimity and friendliness on the stage. A mentor of mine used to joke that if you're not having fights, your coalition isn't big enough. And so in the interest of maybe generating some divergence, not any fights here, I'm curious to ask you guys, who isn't part of the coalition, this fledgling coalition that needs to be? What isn't being done that needs to be done to mount a more effective front? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, so we many of us were involved with the Draw the Line coalition that mobilized on September 20th. We brought together groups across the country. I think it was over 350 different organizations, over 20,000 people on the streets from coast to coast to coast. And it was a learning experience for all of us. We came together. Many of us were in the national body that was coordinating nationally all of the actions that were happening, and then there were also local coalitions that were forming that were planning the actions on the ground as well. I think what we found is that it is hard to maintain a cohesive national coalition that is also mobilizing on the ground simultaneously in a coordinated way. We don't have a formal coalition that is persevering at the national level, but that doesn't mean that we're not talking. We've also deepened our relationships with each other. We continue to be in conversation about what we can do next. It will not be called Draw the Line, but it could take many different forms. We're in conversation about what does it mean, who needs to be at the table, what are the demands, what are the moments. It can't just be a date on the calendar and we mobilize. It needs to be deeper than that. It needs to be relational. It needs to be something that that perseveres for the long term. But I would say that there was a huge gap around Indigenous organizations and groups that are organizing at a national level. I think that that Labor did not have a huge presence in the national coalition.
So I think what's needed, if we say what's missing, I would say everyone is missing, because the vast majority of our people are not really organized into institutions that we understand or engage or bring together. That does not mean people are not organized. People are organized around cultural lines, religious lines. People are organized around not just political issues, but ways of being. People are organized in neighborhoods. People are organized, but we cannot understand those institutions. We have those decision makers are often, and I think Janelle spoke to this, is that corporations and politicians are much more engaged in those spaces than most of the left is. And so we have to think about what is each of our tasks, right? So who is it that we take our task to be organizing the migrant section of the working class, non-permanent residents, which has enormous amount of contradictions and has to be done on one side. Each of us, I think, needs to understand who are we organizing, because it seems that what we're organizing is not people, but sentiment for symbolic purposes. And that is simply incapable of dealing with a world hurtling towards further imperialist aggression, mass impoverishment, and mass death. And I think it requires a kind of enormous political maturity to be able to say, I'm going to say, we work on immigration. For us to, for example, now react to the call for remote work from the people who, as you said, some of whom are the border guards and some of them the people making immigration policy, requires a kind of political maturity we have not built. And if we cannot build the idea of being able to move on a common demand, and I say this on many other issues, it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward. And that kind of political maturity has to be built in each of our organizing spaces.
When I look at leftist wins through this country, I do not think we have seen the left truly work together with Indigenous nations, as sovereign people. I think what the reality is I think the left has assumed that Indigenous people will just always be on their side and always be politically aligned. And there's also this very distinct othering that happens where people don't know how to interact with Indigenous people. I mean, a large part of my work is people coming to me asking, how do I reach out to this Indigenous person, or how do I engage with this community? And I always tell people, if you know how to be a good friend, if you know how to be in relationship with one another, you know how to reach out to Indigenous people. And that means, in our friendships, we offend, we make mistakes, we fall short, and we have to repair. And that's what happens in any relationship. But there's some, I think it's honestly like fragility and ego that gets in our way. And not only is that stopping us from the strategic imperative to win, because as progressives, we should believe that all of this is contested space. Every institution, every workplace, every community, neighborhood, government. Why are we excluding Indigenous nations from that? And we have over 600 unique nations, cultures, languages that have allowed Indigenous people to survive sustainably on these lands, that have forms of governance that put people first. I come from a system where you're considered a good leader if you have not only enough for your clan, but enough to share. Our governance systems are systems of wealth redistribution. And so I think not only are we stopping ourselves from winning, but also stopping ourselves from the gift of seeing a living alternative. And so I think that our movements, I think that our political parties need to acknowledge that those ways of being already exist, and that the despite what Indigenous people have endured in this country, despite the failings of treaties and broken promises, they have still left the door open. Like, how generous and how shameful that we have not taken advantage of that. So I think we've over-focused, maybe even followed the liberal agenda on what it means to be right in relationship, mastering our land acknowledgement, putting our orange shirt on once a year, having a really nice statement about what it means to be respect Indigenous rights and titles on our website, but have not taken that step into the relationship.
The NDP is, 350 plus riding associations. That could be 350 plus community organizing hubs. We've said that a lot of times, but we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the left in this country, by and large, does not really fully engage with electoral power? What is this thing about being nonpartisan that's so specific and almost taken up like as a holist ideological stance that is not strategic? Okay, we are nonpartisan for strategic reasons, but it is almost as if people don't want to run or join elections because we might realize how little power we have. It has been deeply concerning how much in most activist left spaces, in the United States, for its bajillions of failings, when elections comes, and the Democrat Party is no one's friend, you will see base-building organizations mobilizing to get out the vote campaigns. Here, almost nobody does that. So I think the question for me is, what is the role of the NDP, but how does the left actually engage with the question of power and holding power accountable? Because if we treat any political party similarly in this symbolic way, many people hold up their noses and vote for the NDP, right? But don't do anything else the rest of the year to make that party powerful or accountable. Don't fight for it. Don't become members. Don't choose to attack it when necessary, defend it when essential. So I think there is, all of us need to ask ourselves why. That would be my main question, is we have to ask ourselves our engagement with power, because the NDP is what the rest of us have made it.
I just want to say the NDP has not been a welcoming space for those of us that have tried to make it better. And I want to just name that it has been an extremely hostile space for organizers that have come in, or for those of us that have tried to base build and tried to move the party. And that has historically been the case, and I think a lot of people have been burned by that. That doesn't mean that we turn away or we don't try to contend for power as movements. It's essential that we do that. But yeah, I think that's something that we have to work with, is that it's been a difficult space, and hopefully it can be, my hope for the NDP out of this leadership race is that it is a more open space for movements, that people do feel more comfortable re-engaging, coming back to the table after having been burned.
I have found this moment of a leadership race interesting in terms of pushing outside that window, but obviously our direction as movements in terms of breaking out of those ideas, like, it's not going to come from political leaders, even if the best one, whoever else is most excited about gets elected, whatever. Like, we need to, as Hussan said, be applauding when we actually agree with something that has been brought to that kind of a stage, and we need to be pushing it so much further. And that, I think, does mean not having this purity politics of like, oh, I can't get involved because I'm too whatever to be seen in that kind of space, or I'm this. You need to be strategic about it, but also we need to win.
I think that might be a good note to end on. Big thank you to the panelists.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.